Hi, this is Julie Lerman, author of Programming Entity Framework, with the third in a series of beginning Entity Framework tutorials I've created for Visual Studio 2010. You can find more of these videos at www.pluralsight.com. In this video, we'll take a look at the classes that are automatically generated from the model, or more specifically from the model's XML metadata. These are the classes that you'll use in your application, so it's a good idea to get familiar with them. I'll use the model that I created in the first video of this series, which is based on a modified version of the AdventureWorks Super LT database that's one of Microsoft's sample databases. This is a simple e-commerce database. We have customers and orders. Orders have details. They point to products. There's other information. Now, this model is a simple view of the database. I haven't done any customization of the model. That's something we'll look at in a future video. So once you've created your model and your entities and your properties and your relationships between all of the entities, that's wonderful, but we still need to be able to work with them in our code. So we need to have classes that are based on these entities. The designer automatically generates classes for us. We'll look a little bit later how that's done, but what I want to do right now is focus on those classes that are generated. I'm going to start by looking at them in a class diagram, which I've already created from those classes. And if we play my favorite Sesame Street game of one of these things is not like the other, you'll notice that every one of these classes, except for one, that one, inherit from entity object. It will give the classes the ability to be managed as we work with them in Entity Framework. So let's pull out the sales order header and take a closer look at it. So you'll see that we have private fields, properties, and further down, methods. So the private fields are all based on the scalar properties that are defined in the entity in the model. Many of the properties are the public version of these private fields, but there are additional properties as well. For example, one of the scalar properties is a customer ID. This points back to the customer. And in the model, we have a navigation from the sales order header back to a customer and a customer navigation property. So if we go back to the class, we'll see that that customer, not only do we have a representation of the foreign key, the scalar property, but here is the representation of that customer navigation property. So this property will return an instantiated object. In addition, because this is pointing to a single related entity as opposed to a collection, the default template generates one other property that we can use, and it's just a scaled down representation of the customer. Instead of the entire entity, it has something called an entity key. The entity key has the ID, so it would be that customer ID, but some additional information that is useful whether we're working with it directly or the Entity Framework internals work with it. The other type of navigation property we have is entity collection. So sales order details points to a collection of details. So this is created as a property which is an entity collection of sales order detail types. If we take a look down in the methods, mostly what we'll see is changed and changing methods. For each property in the entity, we'll have this pair of methods which are actually partial methods. So the methods are defined in this class, but then in an additional code file, you can actually define the logic behind those methods. And then additionally, there's a factory method. I actually don't use that very often. Sometimes I'll create my own or an overload of this. So all of the other classes are created in the same way. Each of the scalar properties is represented in private fields. We have the public properties that include the navigation properties, and then all of those change tracking methods that are created. Now let's take a look at the object context, and this is the class representation of the whole container. So the whole model, here's the whole kit and caboodle, and it has a bunch of entities in it. So that's what the object context will represent. All of those fields are represented as properties, so we'll just focus on the properties. This container inherits from the object context class, and the object context class gives us all the logic we need to be able to do queries, to update, to save information back to the database, and also to manage objects during the application. So that will take care of change tracking and things like that that we get with Entity Framework. So each of the entities in the model has a wrapper that is, in the model, it's called an entity set, and the class representation is called an object set. So this wrapper is how we get to the sets of entities. So if we want to work with the address entities, we'd start by, for example, doing a query. We would instantiate the context, and then we would write a query that says something like, go look at all the addresses. That's what this is, context.addresses, and bring me back the address whose address ID is 3. Bring me back all of the addresses and sort them by city, however you want to grab them. So the addresses property of the context is really the starting point for all of that. So let's take a look at the actual classes, some of the code. And you'll see this is the CodeGen file here, and it's attached to the model. Every time we make a change to the model, this file will get updated again. All of these classes will get regenerated from scratch. So if you wanted to make changes to the actual classes that are generated, or you wanted to add additional logic, we would do that in partial classes. We wouldn't put that in this file because it'll get overwritten each time. So we open up the file, and we see there's a region for contexts, and there's really only one context here. And here, for example, well, we can see here's where it inherits from object context. Here are all those properties that I pointed out, the object sets. Just open up one of them here. Boy, it's really closed down, all clamped down. So here's the addresses object set, and there's the code that gets run when you request that property. And if we scroll down a little further, I'll just close this up, and we'll look at an entity. So address is there first also. Here's the factory method that I mentioned that I don't really use. Here are all the scalar properties from your model. So each of them has a getter and a setter. And if you look in the setter, you'll see here's some more change tracking going on. Okay, so this calls those partial methods. They don't really have any logic behind them, but you can put your own logic behind them. So really, they're simply declared. There's nothing else behind them. However, this is what will get your information, your change information, up to the object context as it manages it. So there's a lot of management of the objects going on. And by default, all of these classes know how to notify the context when things are going on within them, when changes are being made. Now, I mentioned that these are all partial classes. So you can create a new file and add to the logic of these classes by just adding more partial class logic. So how do we get from the model to these classes? This is done through code generation that happens automatically. And again, everything's a default. There's always a way to change this behavior. But the default behavior for the model is that there's something called a T4 template. T4 is something that's been in Visual Studio since Visual Studio 2008, and it stands for Text Template Transformation Toolkit. Now, I just did that off the top of my head. I'm pretty impressed I got it right. A T4 template has instructions that will have it read the model. Now, the model, we're used to looking so far at the design view of the model, but this is just a designer view. The real model is an XML file. Just open that up. And this is not the conceptual model. This is a representation here of what's in the database. But down here is the conceptual model. So the T4 template has instructions to read through this conceptual model and then spit out the code that you saw in the class over here. So it will first read through the entity container, and for each entity set, it creates those object set properties. Then, as it reads through the entity types and their properties, it creates the code that we saw. So the nice thing is, although we have a default template, I didn't create a template. This is based on one that's buried deep in the file path of Visual Studio. So that happens automatically. But if I want to, I can very easily create a copy of that template, and there's actually a few different templates I can use as a starting point. So I can use the template that created this file. I can use that as my starting point, or some simpler ones. But I can create a copy and have them come right up into this project, and then I can generate from my own T4 template instead of the default template. And that's something that I'll cover in a later video. So for now, you've seen what the classes are that are created from the model, what they look like, and some of the key information that's in there. And these are the classes that we'll work with when we do link to entities queries and when we literally interact with the objects in our applications. And these are the same classes that we'll be using in upcoming videos that I'll be recording as part of this series. So again, I'm Julie Lerman, and thanks for watching this training video on exploring the classes generated from an entity data model.